Um, I I went into this thing because I wanted to find, I don't know, some sort of actual fight against nihilism. This entire philosophy thing, I really haven't considered any critiques or anything really against anything I'm saying. I mean, yeah, I've read like Nietzsche or whatever other stuff, older Christian philosophers, um, Christian books, but everything I read never actually gives a good enough critique to fight against actual nihilism, because all of these things are foundationed on other things that usually have a lot of critiques towards them, which fail to actually go against nihilism. The best arguments against nihilism is always emotional, and emotional arguments always fail because it's based on experiences that don't actually bring any sort of sense or logic, so it can't fight philosophically against nihilism. But but that's not what this entire thing's about, anyways. This is the 40th recording, and it's on my new phone this time. I'm going to Dominican Republic in 3 weeks. I don't know if that's really needed to be said. But I think I read through Deleuze, Nietzsche, a lot of Christian philosophers, all of the German idealists. The stuff I learned about schellings is that my idea on how Schelling's dialect works, like my interpretation of Schelling's dialect, well, Schelling's did use a Fichte dialect. My interpretation was not quasi Schelling's. It was pretty on spot for Schelling's idea of the words he used. I used growth, decay, and new balance, but he used if I remember correctly, he used expansion, contraction, and outgrowth, because he kind of assumed that well, no, actually, correctly, he assumed that growth always goes over contraction, except for that's usually the issue with how I interpret his dialect in terms of culture, because culture is always growth in its thing, because counterculture is always the negation, it's always the contrarian, it's the contraption. Culture always absorbs counterculture in this sort of quasi violence, not actually. It's always just the evolution of culture into a new form, which accompanies but not fully the counterculture and leads to social issues and new countercultures, which can undo the previous counterculture. You know, the whole thing of feminism and the manosphere and how it's not fully incorporated, but a false version of feminism is incorporated, and the counterculture incorporates the culture with it too, which causes the counterculture to lose its revolutionary spirit, and it's the death of counterculture. Still not what I was talking about today. I don't know why I'm going on about so much stuff that I feel like I'm repeating myself on. But I think I was talking about... Okay, so I went for that. At Badial, CZEC, I understood Lacan more. I watched a thing on Lacan's Desire Graph and read a lot of Lacan. Just take all of the terms that I took from my identity dialect video and apply it to Lacan's graph, and mostly it still makes sense. Everything Lacan says to a degree is right. Juvenation and what's it called? Damn, what's the thing called? The thing... It's not circumcision, it's... What's the thing? Okay, I'm just gonna search it up, sorry. What's the... in Lacan, I don't... What? I don't think I wrote that, buddy. I'm just gonna look at the Wikipedia to find it because I can't remember shit. Judith Butler used Lacanian works. Oh yeah, I read a lot of Judith Butler. I really like Judith Butler. I don't really agree with the interpretation of gender, since I interpret gender to be more dialectal, like any other thing that doesn't exist, and incorporated in culture and stuff like that. Reading Fitch, I actually did, to a degree, apply my understanding of Lacan and Fitch with the whole culture thing, because I mean, in the end, the I, not I, and superego sort of synthesis thing, which ruined Hegelian understandings because of this one Russian guy who misinterpreted Hegel's dialect for Fitch's dialect. It's very strange, but Fitch's dialect of I, not I, and absolute I is very inclined with how culture actually works dialectically with self and its connection. Because once again, every single thing that works dialectically because it has so much power over self and is created by self. And when I say self, I mean people in general this time, and not the self that doesn't exist. It's so intertwined in this sort of really complicated system, which I cannot fully explain. Hierarchy, self, culture, class. It's all entwined in a way. And self and culture specifically is very entwined to the point culture is a part of self's dialect as a whole. Culture in this, though, means all of it. Class, culture, everything, including hierarchy. So it's not like real culture. Self is the abomination of everything together. It's everything. Self is especially connected, though, with culture in the way that... So, the absolute I in Fichtean dialect can be seen as culture as a whole, because culture influences people. Culture creates man. You cannot exist without culture, and culture cannot exist without you, because once again, people create it. With Fichte's understanding of humanity, when I was reading it, I thought what Fichte was basically saying, this is my interpretation, was that humanity was knowledge. Knowledge is culture in a way. Absolute knowledge is absolute being, absolute self, which is God. And I wrote a thing here, I could just paraphrase it, but we are fragmented pieces of ourselves because humanity are fragmented pieces of knowledge, and community, which is when humanity recognizes the outside humanity, which is when you recognize the people around you, and you create that sort of knowledge thing. You create culture, which creates absolute being, absolute self, absolute knowledge, which creates God. So, while God creates people, people create God, in the understanding that I had of Fichte at the time. Then with schellings, I don't believe in any of this. I'm never gonna support culture, nor am I gonna say that culture is God or any of that. But what I am saying is, when I was reading Fichte, that's what I got from it. With schellings, it's actually a similar situation, and which then I got to schellings, which I think is where I understand the quasi-schelling stuff, but also, especially on this thing I wrote on nature. Since Fichte understood nature to be oppositional to man, because if man is knowledge, fragmented knowledge, and its complete knowledge is culture, and culture is outside of nature from his perspective. It is the idealistic stuff, He believes the idealistic world to be God. Then he sees the material world, in a sort of Gnostic sense, he sees the material world as naturally bad. It opposes culture. It makes man alienated from his community. Schellings disagrees with that, because Schellings understands that nature... We are both part of nature and culture. The self is part of nature because we are bodily part of nature, if you understand Spinoza and stuff. Hegel said you have to be a Spinoza to be a philosopher. I disagree with that notion, but Spinoza's pretty much right about a lot of things, so... Self is all part of nature, and since nature becomes an absolute, and since absolute will always be God by definition, nature could be understood as God as well. If nature leads to culture, and nature is God and culture is God, then by definition that would be a sort of dualistic trinity, and you could put the creator God in general as the third there, or no, I would actually say that it would be more self, and the self's idea of internalized culture to be basically the Holy Spirit to this sort of Trinity thing. Culture, nature, and internalized of both culture and nature, which is part of the dialectic of self, would be the basic trinity to the sort of Godhead that you would have here, with schellings, Lacanian, and Fitch all together. This is how I interpreted it during that moment. I'm still a nihilist, I don't believe any of this, but it's an interesting concept. Since nature works dialectically through expansion and contraction, and since it is still absolute but always evolving, it gives the sort of always moving sort of idea of God that I'd argue Jesus actually encaptures in itself. I believe Jesus to actually be very transgression, very Nietzschean in nature, but a more softer, less violent version of Nietzsche, a less conservative one too, not in like the normal political sense, which by the way is really stupid, American politics, but like in a sort of moving value sense, in the sense that I think modern Christianity has completely left what Christianity should have been, and I think Nietzschean understanding of Christianity would be more correct. I mean, the whole point of Jesus was to get rid of the concept of sin and replace it with a more mellowed out, less rule-based version of Christianity. I mean, look, Judaism at first was a conservative lining. God at first in Judaism was, okay, I dropped on the floor for what that was. But God in the Judaist lining was basically a force that interacted with the world to keep a reactionary understanding of the world. He had monarchies, he had genocides, and a ton of violence, and you couldn't disobey him. He had laws, tons of them, sacrifices, all of these stuffs. But what Jesus did historically was that he came here into this law of reactionaryism, and he established a more mellowed out version of the thing. When he made his 2 commandments, I interpret this as not an actual 2 commandment state, but the concept in general to be what he was foundationally making. He was making a simplification of all these laws into 2 major laws. And by that, I don't think he really wanted us to follow those 2 major laws as fact, as we did with the hundreds of old commandments, as we were just replacing some rules with more some rules. Instead, he probably wanted us to keep this transgression stage, simplifying each rule to its base core. You take the rational kernel of, I know I just quoted Stalin, but I don't like Stalin's application of this to Marx. This applies more to Jesus, actually. The rational kernel of all these laws, and then that was the 2 commandments. And you take the rational kernel of the 2 commandments, which in end was not about sin or forgiveness. It was to forgiveness on a basis, but it was more about love and being a good person than actual morals. And I'd say Jesus as a whole was actually very anti-morals for a different reason. He believed in just being a good person and love as forgiveness instead of the sacrifice for forgiveness and the morals of a bunch of rules. Jesus as a person was historically very Nietzschean in that sense. He was more transgressional. He believed in getting rid of morals for a more sort of mellowed out, be a good person, and replacing the sacrificial version of redemption and forgiveness for a more just love in general, a more based on your actual heart and a metaphysical sort of soul than any actual sins. So really, Christianity, how it's evolved, is now a new form of Judaism than anything Jesus would have actually liked. Because now all we have is a sort of sacrifice for redemption, but a different kind of sacrifice, a sacrifice of yourself for instead of the redemption of heaven, yeah, but a sacrifice of yourself for instead becoming just an average Christian with the average things. You sacrifice your own being, you sacrifice your own soul for the quote-unquote love of God, which is not in line with Jesus' understanding of actual love, which, while it requires sacrifice, it's not based in sacrifice, like how Christianity has now put it. And then being a good person, because a majority of these Christians aren't good people by heart. They are mostly based on, reward and punishment. I keep forgetting what it was called because I keep confusing it with demand and whatever. But yeah, reward and punishment, and the whole idea of strict morals instead of actual heart-based goodness. So they actually contradict Jesus' main messages in his Nietzschean understanding, where it's mostly about not morals, but the heart of it all, which Nietzsche would have disagreed with because he was kind of about like power and overcoming yourself and whatever. Ugh. But yeah, no, in that sense, while I still don't like the personality of Jesus and I prefer Gnostic Jesus, Jesus is actually very revolutionary, and I would support him. It's not Christianity. And that's coming from a Satanist, so that's like, but whatever. But since absolute nature in Schellings, in my understanding of Schellings and Lacan and Fitch altogether, you would have this sort of trinity between the God of self, the Holy Spirit in this interpretation, the God of nature, which I guess in this interpretation would be Jesus for the whole progressive thing, and the God of absolute, which would be the culture, which would be in line with God the Father, even though nature would be the creation, and actually it would be way more sense for Jesus to be, it would make more sense for Jesus to be culture since it's created by nature. And actually we're gonna go with that, actually, since I don't know, I just got off and my head hurts a lot. Because God the Father would be the creator, right? Nature is also a creator. Nature would be God the Father in this sense. And since he creates Jesus, which creates people, the Holy Spirit, in a sort of downward spiral, while all being connected in a Trinity, then nature would create culture, which creates self. And also, therefore, nature creates self as a thing, you know. So, if self is the Holy Spirit, then obviously culture would have to be Jesus. Despite nature being more progressive and culture being more conservative, this would be the sort of inversion of the Trinity in the usual Christian sense, I guess, in my understanding of the usual Christian sense, which would invert that and make this version of God, basically, this version of the Trinity, basically the opposite of my interpretation of Christianity's version of the Trinity. It is now the Jesus in this that would be conservative, and the Father being the more progressive one, and the Holy Spirit stays the same, I guess, but it's a fractured version of knowledge. The Holy Spirit would be a fractured version of God, would it not? It would be, unlike the Holy Spirit, which the Holy Spirit would be absolute knowledge, but in the form of human conscious, this would be a fractured version of knowledge that exists as the human. We would all be part of God in three ways: the cultural, the fractured, and the natural way, but we would also be alienated from God in three ways as well: being away from nature, being able to influence it as an outsider, being alienated from culture as an individual, and also as fragmented, well, you know, fragmented itself is alienation. You would be fragmented from yourself because you're still part of everything. You're still part of nature, part of culture. You are never going to be your individual self, which is the fractured part of God that you incorporate. So understanding Lacan, Fitch, and Schellings in my interpretation, I actually see it's kind of pessimistic, this idea of God that I've created in those 10 seconds that I then instantly discarded because I realized it's kind of bullshit. It's just very pessimistic because no matter what, you have a sort of alienation from it which you cannot solve. If the embrace of God, the embrace of love and knowledge and all of these, the embrace of nature and yourself and culture is what leads to redemption. If knowing God, becoming God fully is redemption, which I guess in this sort of idea, you know, German idealism, it kind of would be. Becoming God would be the end goal. You would be unable to be God ever. You would be unable to be redeemed. Everyone would be doomed to hell regardless. And that's really all I got from the whole Lacan, Fitch, Schellings thing. I think I'll just call that pessimistic. You know what? Nihilistic theism. To stick with the whole nihilism themed. Nihilistic German theism. This whole nihilistic German theism is actually very pessimistic in its like, and not nihilistic at all. But it's a cool name, so I don't care. And it's really just a sign that if these ideas are right, because at first it made sense to me, seeing that culture, if culture was knowledge, then yeah, human would be fractured knowledge. It made sense, but to the degree you have to realize that God as absolute kind of doesn't mean anything, because if God exists, then yeah, this is the only way God could exist, as the absolute of culture and the absolute of nature. But culture and nature are both very subjective things. Well, not nature really, but culture is a very subjective thing, and you can't really say there's a God in culture unless there's only one culture in this world, or one like absolute human culture, which it doesn't exist. But like, if God were to exist, this is the only way he could exist, through the absolute of community and the absolute of nature in the absolute of self. And this whole idea of community and culture and nature and self being absolute or being God means that philosophically, since self in Lacanian understanding doesn't exist and culture is very subjective and to a degree is a social construct, and nature itself is really flawed and anti-moralist, God could not exist. He would be completely subjective, and according to this, he would also, what's that thing for nature? Oh yeah, be against morals. He would be absolutely nihilistic in his approach. God would be a nihilist. God would not exist by nature. He would be a form of insecurity manifestation, and with that, he would also be subjective. He would change based off of how people understand him. He wouldn't have an objective form, and somehow, with all of that, he would still manage to create the world. He'd still manage to exist to a point where he could influence mankind and be and exist in a trinity of sorts. He would have to be so many contradicting ideas and things that honestly, it's confusing. It's confusing, and I can't make sense of it in any sort of degree that I would see it as realistic. It's more of a science fiction than anything, and not even scientific. It would be more religious fiction. This is an understanding of God which I could not possibly say is true, because it has no foundation other than German idealists who all kind of contradict themselves, and Lacan, and these sort of things. It makes sense. It makes sense in theory when you act, but that's only when you take the positives of all of it. If you take the absolute in the culture, the absolute in the nature, the absolute in theory of the self, while understanding that it's still fractured to a degree to get the Holy Spirit thing. But when you take the actual negatives, it self-destructs, it explodes, it dies. Like the Post-Mainländerist thing I had with the Big Bang being God, its internal contradictions kills it. Actually, add this to my theory of Post-Mainlander Big Bang thing, because it's contradictions that makes God die and create this universe. That's what creates this universe. The death of God, right? The Big Bang. All of that. It's no longer about God being perfect, and since the best thing to do is dying. No, it's now about contradictions that kill God. And what are those contradictions? Well, knowing that culture is the dead carcass of God's brain or something. It is the dead carcass of God in a metaphysical understanding. It's his knowledge, and nature to be the literal carcass of God, Mainlander. Nature is God's dead corpse, and we're living in it. Culture is also God's dead corpse in a metaphysical understanding, and we are still a part of it, since we are nothing but our culture influencing our whole dialectical identity thing, in which actually the identity dialect is very complicated, because the identity itself actually contradicts the self and the imaginary, if you watch my identity dialect thing, the self and the imaginary also contradicts with the identity, and that's what creates the whole alienation too, which is also another dialect for how people understand you in general. And it's just an entire thing, the entire graph of Lacan. It's so complicated, but the whole thing is, we are also, because we are both a part of God's dying corpse in the metaphysical understanding with knowledge, and we are also part of God's dying corpse in the literal sense of nature, then we are God's dying corpse. I said that multiple times, but that means that we still fulfill this trinity of nature, culture, and self. To a degree, I was right with the whole fitche and schellings thing, and to a degree, they are right about it, since we are parts of fragmented knowledge, but it's dead knowledge that no longer is reasonable, no longer is good. It's stupidity. we have to invert this Trinity thing that I've already created. It's not that absolute knowledge is good. No, the dying corpse of God is bad, actually. It's bad for humanity. It's bad because it's dead. It is the opposite of what God should be, because it's no longer God, it's just a corpse. Nature, the absolute of nature, is now pretty fragmented, is it not? It's just nature. It's no longer absolute because there is no absolute, because God is dead. Same thing with knowledge. We barely have any real knowledge, postmodernism, because, well, if knowledge was God, if God was absolute knowledge too, and that's dead, we don't have any other way to actually understand the world. We can never understand the world. We can never philosophically understand the world, literally understand the world. All of this could be fake. If you can't tell, I just looked outside my kitchen window. But yeah, it could be fake. We cannot understand, we cannot ever have absolute knowledge. Kant was kind of right on that. We can never have absolute nature because nature is now fragmented. We can never have absolute self because Lacanian psychoanalysis, because of the death of God, we are no longer a person. When God was alive, and all of these contradictions were all filled into one goal, when there was a person who was God, and there was no people, because when there was just one guy, one being, one God, you had what? A filled nature. Nature was a thing. It was complete. It was entirely in one entity. So it's knowledge. Knowledge was complete. It's entirety in one entity. There's no more idealism because every mind is now one. And self was complete because there was only one being. There was no stupid thing with any of this. And especially with the self, since nature, knowledge, and self was all one being, since it was all one thing, since there was no separation between what was known or what was physically there in nature or what was you, since it was all one being, it was all united, it was all perfect, it was supreme, it was purity, it was God, it was the actual absolute. The actual absolute exists through the Trinity between self, absolute knowledge, and absolute nature. And it's not even a real Trinity because they're all one being. They are not separated. Unlike the real Trinity we have in Christianity, which is like God is not, Jesus is not the Holy Spirit, but they all are God. No. This would be absolute Trinity. This would be just one being. That is all three of them, but just one being. And they become each other. God is becoming... Let me use not the Christian terms, but my understanding. Culture is becoming nature, it's becoming self, it's becoming culture, and they are all becoming absolute, and they are all becoming God because of that. No, they are all God. They are all absolute. They're not becoming. They are only becoming each other. But they never do become it. You never become nature, you never become knowledge, knowledge never becomes nature. They all are only becoming. And the absolute that they all are was what was God. That's what it all was. That's the real Trinity of this whole entire thing. But that died. That's all dead. So there's really no point in talking about it in all reality. This whole thing's kind of stupid. There is no more of this stupid Trinity. There's no more of this God thing because it's all dead. So nature is no longer absolute, nor is knowledge. Self is no longer absolute, it's all fragmented dialectal pieces, which I guess in line could explain why self now has this sort of self-created, in a degree, pseudo-trinity, which isn't even an actual trinity, it's just a bunch of things. Self, class, culture, hierarchy as the links between it, which actually does mirror the absolute trinity that we used to have. This is the quasi or pseudo trinity that we have created, the trinity of the self that we have made. It's now about culture and class and self and trying to merge these all together to a fake trinity that will never work. You can't merge class, culture, and self all together because it will always fail because it's not the real absolute trinity. What it's trying to do, what we are trying to do with this stupid system of class and this society thing is trying to recreate God. We are trying to remake God in order to make ourselves absolute and free ourselves of insecurity. But that will never work because fundamentally we are not absolute. And while God can break apart and he can fracture, fractured things cannot come back together and create itself as absolute. Because when you can break a jar, you can't put it back again perfectly. There will always be fractures. The closest we'll get in a society that actually merges the self, the culture, and the class, probably with the hierarchy, seeing as it's the glue to the jar, I guess, is a broken God that isn't real, that doesn't work. It's nothing. So there's really nothing we can do. You cannot recreate God. You can never bring yourself back into this utopia that the existence of God you had. You can't have the absolute knowledge, the absolute nature, the absolute self. You can't have it anymore. The culture we have now is nothing like the culture that was God, probably. The culture that was God was probably pure culture, something we cannot return to. The nature we had then was probably better than our nature. It was probably utopian to a degree. There was nothing in our paths. And the self that we had there was probably peace. As peace is described as the lack of insecurity. We can only achieve that in death now because we have nothing to recreate the lack of insecurity. Because insecurity is now drive. But back then, back when God existed, back when there was one entity, that insecurity probably wouldn't have existed, since there was nothing to do. There's nothing to be. There was nothing. It is the act of being and nothing at the same time that God was. He wasn't, and he was. He is. But that's why he died. That's why he doesn't exist anymore. Because there's nothing that can be and can't be. But that is fundamentally what it means to be absolute. To be and not to be. Because to just be, you're lacking to not be. You can't do that. To be absolute, you also have to be the exact opposite of absolute. Which, ironically, is absolute. Because to be nothing and to be everything is actually pretty much the same thing. It's internal contradictions, and it kills God. And this whole society that we have put up now is only just trying to restore the utopia that we lost when God died. But to be honest, we never really experienced it. So we never really had the utopia we're trying to create. We're going off of ideas that we don't even philosophically understand ourselves, because none of these people know the shit I'm talking about. No. They're just going off of what they believe, and what they believe they try to put up and smash it into a pile of glass, and they call that God. We will never have God back. We will never have anything back. It's gone. It's dead. We have to accept that we will never recreate utopia, and there's no such thing. Yeah, sure, Marxist utopia, but not real utopia. You can never bring back God. You can't bring him back from the grave. What do you think you are, a necromancer? This is it. This is the final thing we have. It really is. You know, this whole video is supposed to be about social constructs. Yeah. I don't know what I'm doing actually. But no, let me go on about social constructs now. I think I've yapped long enough about the nihilistic German theism that I now believe in, which accompanies the Post-Mainländerist theory I had, in this stupid combination of theories that I call vanity. Because it's a really stupid name, but I can't be associated with people who embody culture in such a destructive force like Queercorism, which, by the way, was a really good name. I hate it. But yeah. I guess now I believe, to a degree, I believe in schellings ideas and fitche's ideas, and this weird little pile of nonsense. Go back together if you can and call it the death of God. But no, I'm just an idiot. But social constructs. This is what this whole thing was about, anyways. Social constructs. To be honest, I don't know what it even means. Social constructs are things that are supposed to describe real things that don't actually exist usually. It can also be something that is just made up on the spot that people believe in. Like, social constructs can be multiple things, but the underlying thing is created by mankind. That's all it really means. It can be something like gender, which was mostly used to describe roles that are put on something that's real. Gender being a combination of sex and gender roles created to be this false ideas. Gender roles being already a social construct applied to gender itself, it just further enforces it. And then they justify it with something real, like sex, and then they say, well, then gender's real, but it's not. But then it could also be something like God and Feuerbatch's idea. That's also a social construct, right? But it's not based on anything real. It's just based on the existence of things in general. My methodology always includes dualism, which could be also dialectic, being subjective, and being a social construct to be being fake. You have to fill all three categories. Why? Well, here's why. Because just because something's a social construct doesn't mean it's not real. However, it does mean that it's trying to make itself real to a degree, right? Gravity is a social construct because it's trying to describe something which naturally happens, but that doesn't mean it's fake. Gravity's pretty real, right? But it's a social construct. Why is it real then? Because it's not dualistic. It doesn't have the proof to make it fake. It's not trying to prove itself in that regard. It just exists as one thing. It doesn't need something else to prove its existence. Therefore, gravity's real. But it's still a social construct. And then what's the other thing? It's not subjective. Gravity isn't subjective. I mean, you could say gravity is subjective to different planets. But in the end, it's not really. It's just different levels of gravity, right? So it's only a social construct. Social constructs can be real, but when social constructs like gender, which is purely dualistic, this is where I change from Judith Butler's ideas to other ideas on how gender works. Because as much as I love Judith Butler, they're not right about gender. Gender is dualistic, not dialectic. Unfortunately, I would love to see a dialectic with it. That's not Fichteian, because I'm not going to say the synthesis between boy and girl is intersex, which doesn't make any sense at all. But no, Judith Butler doesn't understand because okay, so that's another thing I have to work on. Because they basically understand it through Heidegger. That's probably why I almost said because of Heidegger. And if not, I'm gonna work on that later. But yeah, Heidegger understands things through being. I mean, I used Heidegger for the whole thing with God, because Heidegger, to a degree, can be right. But my understanding of being is mostly based on Hegelian being than really anything. Being, becoming, the state between existing and being observed, and all of that stuff. Not Heidegger's. So I actually can critique Judith Butler for this, because they use Heidegger's understanding of being to use it for gender. But the thing is, that's not how not real things work. Judith Butler uses being to see how gender works, but really, in my interpretation, fake things that are not real, that have to prove itself as real in order to gain the trust or existence of people, use dualistic ideas. It's like fascism, right? Fascism uses outsiders to prove its own existence as a nation, right? Actually, I don't like that light. I'm gonna go back to orange. But like how the fascists use it, that's not necessarily a good thing. That's actually bad. It works fundamentally. That's why fascism worked for such a long time, but it's bad. Because it's bad. Like, I know moral nihilism. I know I literally believe in moral nihilism. But what I mean when I say that is fundamentally the whole reason we have this sort of society and all of these issues is because of literally the whole fake thing on how things try to prove itself as real through fake measures like dualism. But just incorporating it more to society just makes more issues when they're trying to solve it. So I don't mean bad from a morals perspective. I mean bad from a systematic perspective. It works, but it doesn't solve anything. Fascism solves nothing. It just incorporates the problem so deep that you genuinely can't tell the difference. It's with Lacan and all of these, like Lacan and all of these other stuff kind of proves that it would work in theory, but it's just not in a way that solves the issue. It just makes you forget they exist. So it's bad systematically because it doesn't fix any issues. It just makes them disappear. In a way that's gonna come back to probably haunt you guys 6 million years later when everyone's fucking depressed and just committing suicide. So that's how fascism fails. Not from a systematic fail, but from the fact they incorporate the problem so deep into people's minds where I don't know, not even therapy is gonna fix that. I mean, it's not like therapy actually fixes anything. The mental health industry, God, do I hate the mental health industry. But that's beside the point. The point is that unreal things work through dualism, the same way fascism works, which is why gender, as a binary as it started out, worked like how it was. To a degree, you could consider it like a dialectic solution to a dualistic approach, which, I mean, seems kind of stupid. Why would you make a dialectic out of dualism? But yes, the binary usually is the whole boy-girlfriend thing, which works as not being than being. I think that male and female are actually defined by what they're not than what they are, because when you're a guy, you're only really defined by not being girly. You're gonna get bullied if you're girly or something. So they apply fake ideas that make you seem manly, but in reality, no matter how much you incorporate these ideas of manliness, no one's gonna actually treat you like any more manly. Just like, I guess economically, but nowhere actually like in the idea of connection socially and self. Only if you act like girly would you actually be affected in a negative way, you know, or in general, because you get bullied. So manliness only exists by what it's not. It does have what it is, but that's only really applicated to girliness, actually. Girliness works the same way. It's defined by what it's not. Yeah, sure, you might have like all this stuff with like, oh, well, you know, girls wear dresses, but that's not actual definition. That's just works against manliness. You know, it's gonna treat you any more girly if you're like a girly girl or a normal girl. They only care if you're a masculine one, because then there's a problem there. It's defined by what it's not, just like masculinity. Femininity is defined by what it's not, and what it's not is masculine. So it's basically based on each other fundamentally. You can't be manly if girls didn't exist. You can't be girly if men didn't exist, because once again, then what are you doing this for? What are you wearing a dress wouldn't be considered girly if men didn't exist, because it's opposition. That's what it mostly is, opposition. Gender works dualistically just like anything else. It's based on opposition. So back to with the thing with girls, because I don't think I explained it correctly enough, but I'm just gonna add a few more notes on that, because it actually goes into the whole thing with trans people too, because now they're trying to alienate trans people by going, well, that's you're manly and you're trying to be a girl. This is the main case, because a lot of the news goes over like men trying to become girls, which, you know, is just normal trans girls. It's not anything weird. I don't know why these people talk about it like it's a threat to nature, but they talk about it like it's like men trying to turn into girls to win over or assault or something. When they do that, it's because they already have the distinction with gender and the whole dualism thing where girls can't be manly and men can't be girly. They don't care if a man becomes more manly or a girl becomes more girly, fundamentally. Like, you might be more respected, but like socially, they don't actually do anything more. So when they have this sort of men that are like literally biologically female, they kind of, well, actually, usually they kind of ignore it, because they think, oh, well, that's not a threat. We can't make people scared of that. But they still they still experience a ton of discrimination and other things that are bad, and including bullying. Like a lot of bullying, and I do want to put that forth. But the main issue with news and political areas, because they like to not focus on trans girls specifically, no, trans guys specifically. It's so confusing when I have to say both words and they both start with trans. It's like, if I could just say girls and guys, but then you'd confuse them for cis girls and cis guys, and it's like, yeah. So usually, the issue with how the news portrays trans girls specifically, which is M2F, by the way, is by portraying them as only doing it for sexual purposes or some sort of violent purposes. Since the start of time, they only really focus on trans girls instead of really trans men, because they kind of overlook trans men in general, because it doesn't scare them. It doesn't give enough transphobia. But in general, they also just encourage discrimination against them too, because the whole it's only two genders and you can't change or blah blah blah. And the whole issue with that is that it makes it seem, in comparison, that trans men experience less discrimination, even though fundamentally they experience the same amount of discrimination. But people just ignore that, because the scare factor of the news fundamentally makes it seem like trans girls are an actual threat to people, because what they want to like switch their genders. Wait, but they're switching their genders to the weaker one. It's also based in misogyny. Yeah, fundamentally it's based in misogyny. Trans misogyny is based in misogyny. Who could have guessed? Man, if only someone told me. But also in turf ideas about how femininity is a factual thing. So the thing is, feminism split into two when culture corrupted it. I talked about this with manosphere stuff, but feminism can split into two, basically. Traditional and actual progressive real feminists, but whatever. There's also like the hypersexual, and the hypersexual group actually belongs in the traditional feminist group too, even though a lot of people like to praise hypersexual ideas of females as progressive, when really it's the same thing with the anti-hypersexual ones too, because so here's the thing: anti-hypersexualism usually falls into normal traditional feminism, which is like the feminism which promotes what both forms of the male gaze. If the male gaze applies to two things, hypersexualized women and traditional women, and anti-hypersexual feminism and hypersexual feminism falls into both. Now, of course, there's the middle thing, where people just ignore the whole hypersexual feminism thing and just talk about actual feminism, which is normal feminism, by the way, which is like xenofeminism, I'd say cyberfeminism, gender abolitionists. Those are the main categories of the newer feminism, which actually works, unlike the older ones that's been corrupted by culture. These ones usually focus on actually abolishing gender in general, or I know lesbian NRX is actually considered a joke, but no, it's actually really based, like extremely based. I don't know why people don't take it seriously. But anyways, probably because it's in its basis on Nick Land, and Nick Land was kind of schizophrenic, I'd say, but actually I think he was just actually on a ton of drugs. I mean, I saw an article that said he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but I don't know if that's really true or not. I mean, there's a lot of good philosophers who had schizophrenia. To a degree, I think it's because he took a lot of drugs. I mean, he had a mental breakdown over the drugs, so I think it's actually pretty much that. But that could have been like actual schizophrenia too, because I can cause it. But I don't know if I should be trusting a news source over whether Nick Land has schizophrenia or not. I don't know. But yeah, normal feminism is usually on the more gender abolition side, because they understand that gender itself is kind of misogynistic by nature, because gender was created, and here's the thing about gender in general, is you mostly understand gender through dynamic, right? Dualism. The gender dualism also applies for straight relationships, which I think I talked about in the heterosexuality thing. on how straight relationships are the absolute expression of gender in its purest form, like traditional straight relationships, because they show just how gendered it is. Because like outside of relationships, gender barely applies. Outside of like patriarchy and stuff, which are mostly based in the whole heterosexual ideas. Because relationships is very integral to society to a point where it's basically very, very violently shoved into society. It's very gross. But outside of relations, gender doesn't really do anything. But since the patriarchy is based in heterosexuality and heteronormative stuff actually shows how gendered society really is, and its straight relationships are the purest forms of gender realization. You can see the dynamic between a man and a woman is best in straight relationships, and it tells you what you need to know about gender and masculinity and femininity, and how gender itself and how in straight relationships show this, gender itself is mostly based in power dynamics which are misogynistic by nature. So then straight relationships become the main force you can see gender affecting society, which shows that heteronormative ideas, heterosexuality, gender, is all connected. And I'd say heterosexuality is actually pretty misogynistic, but whatever. Damn, I've been talking for like 49 minutes, 51. Then you would understand that gender itself is misogynistic, and that's where the idea of trans people being a threat comes from, because it threatens the idea of gender itself. Well, you can say, well, it maintains the idea of gender because you're just switching from one to the other. It's actually naturally revolutionary to the idea of gender, because if gender is a binary, right, in this conservative understanding, and you create a switch between the binary, and then you have other ones who are being accepted, such as non-binaries, between the switch of the binaries, and it becomes confuddled, right? It becomes messy. It's less clean, it's less dualistic, it's less guy, girl, guy. If guy can become girl and that's normal, and girl become guy and that's normal, then you realize that really it doesn't mean anything, right? And if there could be people who's not guy or girl, it threatens the idea of gender itself. Trans people threaten gender itself, and that's why it's such a concern to these people. And that's why they also scapegoat trans girls specifically, because that's the only ones they can really scapegoat. Like, who cares if, in their idea of mankind, if a girl turns into a man? Because, I mean, well, you know, the girl's gonna be weaker, blah, 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 biology, that's not even true, by the way. Then, oh, and by the way, I made a video which had some false information. I do realize now that estrogen and testosterone are in both man and woman, which only furthers my point that gender is probably the only thing that exists. Like, sexes are very, very, very similar to the point it barely makes a difference, because if you have both estrogen and testosterone in your body, what's the point in saying estrogen is masculine? No, what's the point in saying estrogen is feminine and testosterone is masculine, when that could be not the case if biology just, you know, switch levels a bit, which it could, and it does happen a lot. But whatever. What I'm saying is, they don't see it as a threat, these people, if a girl becomes a man, because they think the girl's weaker, so like, who cares? But if they see a man become a girl, they try to use that as a scapegoat against the revolutionary spirit of transgenderism by then saying, well, look what it's doing. And then that further proves trans misogyny to be just a defense mechanism to these people by scapegoating a certain type of person to attack the entire community. Seriously out of breath here. Was I going with this anyways? But yeah, that also brings me to the point that gender, right? It's actually more revolutionary to have more genders, because it destroys the meaning of gender and therefore would abolish gender. Okay, so you know how being everything is being nothing, right? The whole thing with God and blah blah blah. So, also, if you have like a million different genders, then really you don't have gender at all. It doesn't mean anything. It just means whatever you feel comfortable with calling yourself. I know I said Will Wood's idea of all identities aren't valid is like really cool and stuff, but at the same time, all identities being not valid is the same thing as all identities being valid, because in the end, not being and being is fundamentally the same. The only time not being and being is different is in death. That's it. And even then, it's actually more in between, but whatever. So, then when you have this idea of you have non-binary, trans, all of that, then you include more things. I mean, bigender, pangender. No, bigender, then you would have to add like agender, and then more genders, and then you get the xenogenders, which makes sense, and I support, by the way. And then you have fangender, because that happens after. And then just a ton of stuff, polygender, and when you get to a point where everyone has their own gender, then there's no gender, there's no matter. It doesn't matter. I'd also like to say that performative gender makes sense. Judith Butler's idea of performative gender makes sense, but at the same time, we should abolish that too. Abolish performatives. Do whatever you want. If you want to perform, if you don't want to perform, doesn't matter. It's the same way with pronouns and gender. Two different things, doesn't matter. You shouldn't connect them. Disconnect them. Why not? Language itself is kind of oppressive in a degree, and I believe that I don't like language, actually, which also brings my whole point of the best thing to do if you want utopia is die, because if the whole world dies, we get rid of language, which is very oppressive, and we have no way of avoiding it. Yeah, I wish I could just abolish pronouns in general, but once again, language, you can't. Language. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, culture is pretty hard to dismantle. Class nowadays is kind of impossible to dismantle. Just die. Self, especially self, is impossible to dialectically solve because it's yourself. You can't do that. And also you'd probably just die if you don't have any insecurities. So once again, self, and everything else in that, because those are like the main three things. I can't think of anything else. Culture, class, self, yeah. Hierarchy included. The best way to achieve utopia is to just stop existing. And that's really the only thing you can do, which is why anti-natalism is such a good idea. But people don't take it seriously because, oh, but we want to live. Shut up. No, it's not about you. It's not about you. It's not about you. We have our own agendas, and you can do your little thing until we snip it off. And then it's done. You're done. But whatever. But the point of being is that when you have so many genders, it doesn't matter if there's genders or not, because it doesn't exist anymore, and that's fundamentally good. It's an abolition of gender by creating so many genders. It's gender accelerationism. Gender accelerationism is pretty based, actually, because it fundamentally does destroy gender to have too many genders. I also think it's very hypocritical that people call themselves anti-gender, and what they mean by that is that they believe in two genders. That's not being anti-gender. Actually, the pro-gender people, the ones who have 1 million genders, is actually more anti-gender than these anti-genders in quotations. God. I mean, I'm sorry. May he rest in peace. Yeah, I know, it's such a funny joke. Whatever. I think I've said a lot about that, but what else was I gonna say? I don't know if that was it. We're reaching a 1 hour mark. But I think if I go back to what I was talking about, the dude was really boring and I don't have anything to say about him. He's stupid and he's pretty Hegelian. He just doesn't want to admit it, but he is. Zizek makes sense. I don't need to talk about him. Yeah, I think queer theory is actually really cool, naturally, but I do still prefer everyone just dying. I mean, as a nihilist, it makes sense. But also preferring as a nihilist in general also doesn't make sense. But once again, being a hypocrite is the only thing you can do. If you're not just gonna die on the spot, and once again, I can't. I've tried, I can't. I physically cannot. They won't let me. So, technically, I have no choice but to be a hypocrite. And, it's fun. It's fun to be a hypocrite. So, once again, well, why would I be opposed to this? And seeing as where was I going with this? Where was I going with this? I don't know. Damn. I still think Vanity Theory is a stupid name, but it kind of reminds me of the communization theory, which is pretty cool. I mean, I'm not saying I understand or support or understand the communization theory, but it's a cool name. Which I think shows that I'm not a philosopher, because I mean, if I'm saying, oh yeah, I chose my philosophical theories name, my category of philosophical theories name from it being cool, that's totally how philosophers work. Imagine if Noam Chomsky just named his manufacturing consent, theory of consent manufacturing, because it sounded cool. No, because that at least made it sound like what it's talking about. Imagine if he named it like theory of cyber sex, or worse. I don't want to say the word actually because I think it's pretty insensitive, and to be honest, I don't know, I get sick at hearing it. But the other cyber thing. And he could have named it that, really, and it would make sense, saying manufacturing consent. It would make total sense politically to name it that. But he didn't, because he realized that's a stupid name. Which is what distinguishes me from philosophers. Yeah. So I went over my Nietzschean understanding of Christianity, which, by the way, if I become a priest, I will be using that version of Christianity, because it's just so peak. It's so peak. Yeah. Yeah, I don't get it. But whatever. Yeah, I was gonna talk about something else, and I do think I was. I mean, let me see. I have that. Yeah, I don't have much else. It's on queer theory. I had this other thing I was gonna read. I also discovered this one channel which was talking about something about Hegel's understanding of schizophrenia. It was very strange. Okay, psychology. I know psychology. No, something about queer theory. If I could remember. Oh, I could just look through my search history. Yeah. Why don't I do that? Why am I so stupid? I mean, why am I so smart and intelligent? Yeah, no, yeah. Cyberfeminism? No, I already said I was based. A ton of stuff about Deleuze. Yeah, more stuff about Judith Butler. Intersex. Homestuck. Yeah, no, I'm not talking about Homestuck in my philosophy video, God. Overall, I think that's it. I'm not gonna look through everything. I'm not gonna try to find whatever I was talking about. I think this is it. Fundamentally. And, yeah. The Trinity does exist, but it's just my nihilistic, evil German Theism Trinity, and we're all gonna burn in hell because there's nothing else to do. By definition, we are actually gonna burn in hell if we die, because hell is just existing. Well, actually not existing, because just being outside of without God after death. And if God's dead, if we die, guess what? Where are we gonna be? Dead without God. Yeah, we're all going to hell. It's such a funny thing to say. Like, how can you believe in hell if you're a nihilist? How could you believe in God creating this world to a degree, I guess, while still believing in the Big Bang, but still be a nihilist? God existing at a certain point in time must mean that there's values, right? No, he was value, and he died, so I don't know if he really exists now to tell us what values are. Yeah, I'm dragging this on for way too long. Bye, this is the 40th recording.